11:45 a.m., less than 15 minutes before Helios Flight 522 will run out of fuel. Crew member Andreas Prodmero is conscious, but just barely. His oxygen supply is low. Next to him, his fiancée Haris Charalambos is unconscious. On his other side is the purser, Luisa Voteri. Andreas gets to his feet shakily. His thoughts are foggy and unclear. As he looks into the cabin, he sees a scene straight from a ghost movie. The entire compartment is silent. Not a sound or movement from any of the passengers. Oxygen masks dangle in the frigid, ice-cold air. Then it comes back to him in a wave. The entire plane has depressurized. He needs to get to the cockpit. He searches the chief flight attendant's pockets, looking for the passcode for the cockpit door. Found it. His legs feel like rubber, and his vision is blurry as he rushes down the cabin. The passengers look asleep, as if nothing has happened. Something catches his eye, out the windows. What is that? He forces his eyes to focus. It's a plane. Not just any plane, but a military jet. No time to think. He has to get to the cockpit. His fingers move across the touchpad, but he can't will them to follow his commands. He tries again, and the door unlocks. The sight in the cockpit is a nightmare. The first officer is slumped over the controls, the pilot on the floor. As he looks out the window at the fighter jet, he hears the left engine flame out. August 14th, 2005. On this fateful day, the alarm clock woke Haris Charalambos. She was scheduled to operate Helios Flight 522 from Cyprus to Prague with a stopover in Athens. Her fiancé, cabin crew and pilot, Andreas Prodmero, slept on next to her as he had no flights that day. As his girlfriend continued to prepare for her flight, Andreas's phone rang. A last-minute cancellation. One of the crew members of Flight 522 had called in sick. Could he take his place? Half awake and red-eyed, he considered the request. Go back to bed and sleep a few more hours? Or join his future wife on the flight? Though he didn't know it yet, this fateful choice meant he would spend his last day on Earth with the love of his life. The ill-fated plane had returned from London hours earlier. Cabin crew had reported a loud banging and ice forming around one of the doors. It was ground engineer Alan Irwin's job to investigate. It wasn't the first time this plane, and specifically this door, had experienced issues. With this knowledge in mind, Irwin prepared to pressure test the door seal. As with all commercial flights, the Boeing 737-300 is pressurized to ensure breathable air. In normal operation, the pressurization system works automatically to keep the cabin safe and comfortable. However, while on the ground, Irwin needs to pressurize the cabin to check the door seals. By switching the pressure control setting from auto to manual, he can pressurize the plane and check for leaks. The test completes, with no incident and no findings. But this would later come back to haunt Irwin. Had he returned the switch to auto once he was done? He remains adamant that he did, and that the lack of pressurization was due to a failed outflow valve. But investigators weren't persuaded.
Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff.
Captain Hans-Jürgen Merton and co-pilot Pampos Charalambos, no relation to Haris Charalambos. Merton, an experienced East German pilot, had almost 17,000 total flying hours and 5,500 in the 737. Charalambos had over 7,500 total hours and almost 4,000 in the Boeing. As the two pilots went through their pre-flight checklist, neither noticed the pressurization system was set to manual. Even more surprisingly, they continued to miss this setting 2 more times during the after-engine start and after takeoff checks. By now, the plane was climbing at 2,500 feet per minute, with no one suspecting that the cabin wasn't pressurized. The takeoff had proven uneventful, but all this was about to change as they approached 12,500 feet. The cabin pressure has reached the equivalent of 10,000 feet, triggering the cabin altitude warning. The response is clear. Pilots put on their oxygen masks and immediately descend. However, this never happened. Instead, Merton disconnected and reconnected the autopilot and auto-throttled several times, as well as reducing thrust. If it wasn't for the following conversation, we might never have known why he acted so oddly. Irwin made it habit to remain at the airport until 30 minutes after takeoff. He rushed back to flight control and spoke directly with Merton. What he told Irwin next would explain his odd reaction to the cabin altitude warning. The pilot reported a takeoff configuration alarm and an equipment coolant warning, with no mention of the cabin altitude alarm. The takeoff configuration warns the crew that the plane is not correctly set for flight when they are beginning takeoff. This can be from not setting the stabilizers or extending the flaps. However, the key to this alarm is that it only works when there is weight on the wheels. It can't sound when the plane is already airborne. If Merton had thought he had heard the takeoff configuration alarm, his reaction to disable and enable the autopilot and autothrottle makes sense. This begs the question, how did Merton mix up the two warning alarms? Simple, they were the same alarm. Since the takeoff configuration alarm could only trigger on the ground and the cabin altitude warning only in midair, Boeing had assumed the pilots would know the difference, a fatal mistake. Since Merton could not discern the cause of the first warning, he went on to the second, the equipment cooling warning. This system uses cabin air to cool the avionics in the cockpit. As the 737 continued to ascend, crossing 16,000 feet, the lack of cabin pressurization meant the air density was too low. This triggered both equipment cooling lights to flash off and the master caution light to illuminate. This master caution is something to keep in mind for later. Merton told Irwin over the radio, "Both my equipment cooling lights are off." What he meant to say is, "Both my equipment cooling off lights are on." Irwin responded simply with, "This is normal, as the off light should be off in normal operation." As they continued trying to diagnose the problem, the plane continued to steadily rise past 18,000 feet. As the cabin pressure passed 14,000 feet, the cabin oxygen mask automatically deployed. The pilots would have been alerted to this by the master caution illuminating. However, it was already lit due to the equipment cooling warning. The plane continued its ascent, the pilots none the wiser to the impending disaster. At this point, Irwin's recollection of events becomes unclear. He states, he asked Merton to confirm that the cabin pressurization switch is set to auto. However, a record of events on the day show no such question being asked. In any case, the captain ignored him and asked where the breakers for the equipment cooling system were. Irwin advised him they were behind his seat. After that, there was no further radio contact with Helios Flight 522. Minutes later, the plane reached its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, higher than Mount Everest by thousands of feet. Above 26,000 feet is the death zone. The air is so thin that the brain isn't supplied enough oxygen. It's mere minutes before losing consciousness due to hypoxia without an alternate oxygen supply. By now, Andreas and the cabin crew would have donned their portable oxygen supplies and would be assisting the passengers with theirs. Everyone would be awaiting an announcement from the captain, but by this point, Merton would be unconscious on the floor of the cockpit, likely having tried to reach the equipment cooling breakers. In the co-pilot's seat, the first officer was slumped over the controls. Neither man had an oxygen mask on. The crew would have tried in vain to reach the captain via the intercom, only to receive no response. Their next step would have been to try to enter the cockpit, but post 9/11, all cockpit doors were armed and secured. The purser would have an entry code, but even with oxygen, it would be becoming increasingly difficult to think and function. In the end, we don't know what happened inside the plane for the next 2 hours. Did the crew lose consciousness as well? Were they trying to get into the cockpit? The plane continued to Athens. The flight had not responded to any calls, but had now oddly lined up for a landing. The only problem? It was still at cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. It was a ghost flight. The autopilot was in charge of its silent cargo. As it overshot the landing, the autopilot defaulted into a holding pattern circling Athens. At this point, the Hellenic Air Force was called in to intercept Flight 522, and first responders were alerted to stand by for an imminent disaster. The two F-16s slowly approached, unsure what to expect. Terrorism? Incapacitation? As they inched alongside the Boeing, they saw something they'd never want to see again. The cabin was filled with hanging oxygen masks, but nobody moved. The people looked asleep, no signs of struggle or violence. Were they all dead? The jets moved up to the cockpit and saw the first officer slumped over his controls. The pilot, nowhere to be seen. No oxygen masks. The F-16s continued to shadow the ghost flight, the weight of what would happen next on their minds. The plane would soon run out of fuel and crash into Athens. Would they have to shoot it down? What happened next was recorded by the black box. A chime. Then again, it was a door access request. Someone was trying to get into the cockpit. To the F-16 pilot's surprise, they saw someone enter the cockpit. It was Andreas. He sat down in the pilot's seat. Just as a glimmer of hope emerged for Helios 522, the inevitable happened. The left engine flamed out due to a lack of fuel. The plane turned sharply left before leveling out and began to descend. The flight recorder captured steering input at this time, meaning Andreas had tried to regain control of the plane. It continued its rapid descent. The F-16s moved in and saw the first officer was sitting up now. However, he was still unconscious. Andreas had probably tried to awake him, but the man was probably already comatose. The black box recorded Andreas calling Mayday 5 times, but his radio was tuned to the original station still, too far away to be received. Descending fast to 7,000 feet, the right engine flamed out. No fuel. The plane could only glide now. For the first time, Andreas looked up and waved at the fighter pilots. The jets signaled Andreas to follow them, but his only reply was to point down as if to say, "The plane is going down. There's nothing I can do." Andreas did what he could to avoid populated areas as the plane careened towards the mountains north of Athens. The F-16 stayed with him as long as they could, pulling away at the last moment. Just before the plane impacted, Andreas attempted to pull the nose up to soften the blow, but to no avail. The 737 hit the ground at over 400 miles per hour. Helios Flight 522 down. As the investigation began, various issues and failures came to light. As the finger pointing started, Erwin found himself at the center of the intrigue. The pressurization panel was found, with the selector pushed past the manual stop. Erwin felt this proved that the impact had broken the panel switch and that he had left it in auto. However, further investigation into the pressure control system logs showed that the outflow valve was fully open the entire flight, which would have prevented the plane from pressurizing. Though a mistake was made, there were plenty of other checks which should have caught the issue before it became a tragedy. The flight deck had missed numerous checks, indicating the system was in manual. However, beyond this, the reuse of the cabin pressurization and takeoff configuration alarm had proven to be dangerous and confusing. Boeing being held somewhat accountable for mistakes, Helios itself took much more blame. The airline was a shambles and soon went bankrupt. One of the more tragic sides of hypoxia that the passengers and crew experienced is its insidious nature of creeping up on you. The higher the plane climbed, the stronger the effects of the lack of oxygen became, but not in an obvious way. Thinking would become harder, motion slower, and ultimately you would just fall asleep in a state of euphoria. And this is the real heartbreak of the story. Andreas would have been suffering from hypoxia, but yet still attempted to save the flight and its passengers, not realizing that they had been starved of oxygen for hours. The oxygen mask only provided 15 minutes of oxygen. They all had irrecoverable brain damage. Perhaps this is what happened during the hours after takeoff and prior to the crash. Had he tried to revive and save his fiancée? Investigation showed that all 121 people on board the plane were alive, but essentially brain dead when it crashed. Even if he had managed to successfully land the plane, he would have been its only true survivor.
The tragic story of Helios 522, the ghost flight. Please remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Until next time.